Hey guys, I'm just doing a quick intro for you guys because I have a new video from Bill. And I came out here to try to record with my drone, but this is too windy. I'm not going to send it up. But hopefully this week I'll have a video of the ridge for you guys with my drone. So be sure to come back. But stay tuned for a video of a report from Bill. He did put something together and hope you enjoy it. Thanks guys, and this is Cindy with EZC Productions. Stay tuned.
Greetings everyone. Nice to be back. I guess welcome to the 1-year anniversary of Rattlesnake Ridge. Hard to believe, isn't it? Before I get started with anything, I probably should mention that Cindy has done a remarkable job with all of this. You know, for a non-geologist, Cindy really does see it. The pictures that she brings to you, while she may not be able to explain them in the best terms or scientifically accurate, she does indeed see the issues that are going on here. Case in point, I could probably take a half a dozen geologists to that site and point things out, and they may not even see it. Cindy has just a great eye for this stuff, and her diligence throughout the entire year has just been absolutely incredible. So I join the rest of everybody that's been watching and thanking Cindy so much for all these efforts, and it's been a real education for me as well. Without further ado, let's start to look at things. What you see in front of you is my base quarry map that when I got started with all this, it was the first thing and I think that's good for anybody that wants to get into something like this. Get an overview of everything, you know, and look at the big picture. Look at everything that's around, you know, rather than honing in on certain small areas like, you know, this little cut here. I mean, all equally important, but it's is any good geologist will tell you, you know, a good overview of what you're planning to investigate is always a good thing. So, and in this case, when we look at the quarry map, we see a lot of differences now, albeit subtle. It's just been subtle, and I've read comments throughout the year that you know, this is basically just a slow creep, which the Norris and Wiley report back in February, I believe, pointed out, and they were accurate, and that's indeed exactly what's happening here. It's just been a very slow and deliberate slide, if it even eventually ever slides at all, in a catastrophic sense. I'm not 100% convinced that's going to happen, and we'll try to tell you why. I think you know, the interesting development with this, and you know, I think we were all kind of looking at this thing in more of a slide towards the south within the quarry itself seemed obvious, right? I believe there was a question on one of Cindy's recent videos of how this began, and I'm not exactly sure in the question, but if you mean how this slide began, geologically, well, it's probably good enough for another video probably, but as this slide began, I think we can all agree by this point, indeed, you know, the quarry operations undermine the stability of the slope, and therefore it started to slide. Again, you keep cutting this out with nothing in front of it. Something may happen. In this case, it did. But I'm not you know, I think we can see now that the southerly movement is not as severe. I might be missing something, but and again, I just see it in pictures, but it may not be as severe as the western movement that we're currently seeing now. You can look back at, I believe a week ago, one of Cindy's videos did show, or I'm sorry, it's a drone video that's out there that was relatively recent, maybe within the last couple weeks, and the drone did in fact fly over the quarry, and you'd be hard pressed to say it looks any different than it does in this picture right now. Which leads us to, probably the preferred movement of this particular slide. But just in review, this is a photo that probably the first one I put out regarding this, and I think that basically, Diamond from the Abraham Ranch Project put this in one of his videos as we were debating it. And as you can see at this time, I actually needed the snow on the face just to see anything, which is obviously going to be, we'll get into that more. But this at the time, again, we kind of had a southerly movement in this particular slide, and early on there was no reason to think otherwise. But that being said, as we're going to see, this western, as I called it at the time, the western face failure surface has really developed. But I think it's important to point out a couple of things regarding this early picture, is that these shear fractures here, dilatant fractures, more in a up and down kind of direction, these blocky patterns, they're still there. You're not going to see it in the recent videos, but those fractures, if you will, are still there. I think probably the most interesting one, and I had no idea that this would ever take the form that it did, is this little tiny shear fracture right here. And as it turned out, as we will see, it has quite an impact. Again, I think probably what we're dealing with here, and let's just go to when the snow melted. This was later in January of this year, and I think I was demonstrating water runoff at the time, that being these areas here, not knowing if they were coming from the quarry itself, within the rock itself I should say, or just general runoff from, but it seemed like it was coming from inside the quarry. And these are, I think, still just as important as the fractures and the cracks that I just showed you. These elements all still exist. Just because you won't see them the same way doesn't mean that they're gone. Again, I just found this interesting to look at how subtle this western failure surface that was aptly named, how subtle it really was back in January. Little did we know that it would take a very unique form. To go back to the question a little bit of how this formed, I was fortunate enough to find, this is an aerial photograph of Rattlesnake Ridge almost before maybe minor operations, but before any operations at all. And this is just a simple valley cut, which you'll find practically anywhere on the planet. But I find it significant because that lines up with the scarp on the eastern face, which is that was kind of the big thing at that point back in the beginning. The eastern face was getting all the attention, and for good reason. And as we can see now, relieve you from the pictures, but I just found this interesting that prior to any quarry operations, what it actually looked like, and it was just good. It was fortunate to be able to find this. Why is that important? This valley cut, they just don't form for a reason. Could it be a fault that's not discovered, not mapped, I should say, not necessarily discovered, because don't want to take anything away from the state geologist by any respect, but is it just a fracture a fracture zone of some. It's got to be something. It's just not. They just don't happen. But in this case, it was probably the lead-in to the quarry operations. It gave them kind of an in rather than essentially mining from the highway. I think this road here kind of, they just cut their way in and started slicing this back. So, which pretty much all of this is now all the way up to the end of the valley. The old valley cut is all quarry operations at this point. So I just found that just an interesting picture of what was what at the time. I wanted to find another picture here. Yeah, let's do that one. Yes. This is another one of Cindy's great videos, but the south face to this point, looking in from the quarry side into the landslide itself. And we've seen through the months that the headscarp here has developed quite a bit since the inception, and certainly along the eastern face at this. But I think what we're not finding or not seeing as readily is the southern movement that we all kind of thought was possible or more likely. Instead, I think what we are seeing based on these scarps here, these transverse, as we call them, transverse fractures here, this thing, and it was documented in the Norris and Wiley report that there would be bulldozing, and that is, I think, what we're seeing here, particularly on the western face. In essence, this is dropped down, but there's so much under, there's no empty space there, so things have to move. And in this case, yes, I think it has, the drop down in that has caused, I think, what I'm reading a lot about bulges in the comments, and yes, that's exactly what's happening. This is starting to bulge out. But I think we have to keep in mind, as we will see in the next pictures here, that, and as we can see with this, I think this makes it pretty clear that these, and it was written in the report, that these beds are essentially horizontal, 10 degrees at the most. And at this point, I don't see anything that would tell me that that's wrong, even though that the slope itself seems like it's 20-30 degrees. The beds underneath are not 20-30 degrees. That's my point, because that's the important part, because in general with any landslide, there's two main factors that really, and we've talked about this and shown pictures and videos and whatnot, but just to recap that with any landslide, there's two major factors that influence whether there's failure or not, and that's the weight and the angle of inclination. And as I just mentioned, the 10 degrees is not enough in this case, barring any seismic loading, meaning earthquakes, and they have to be major. The 1-0s, 2-0s, I'm not sure. It's looking at the western face, yes, but that might have more of an impact on the western face than it would on the eastern face. But the bulge is in fact real, and Cindy is indeed seeing that. But yeah, I think kind of a surprise, I think, in a little bit, is the down drop here in this area and the heave or bulging in this direction. Now again, with that in mind, that we mentioned the horizontal slopes, I think this kind of confirms it. As you can see, this is a picture from 3-4 days ago that Cindy took. Sorry, the quality's kind of a little iffy, but it's okay for our purposes. It doesn't matter. But we can see, if we kind of move it towards the western side, again, the beds are still, as they were on the other side, the quarry side, these are still horizontal. But that's indeed what's happening here. Is, as we mentioned before, the dilation or the pushing of the bulldozing of that ridge towards the west is just pushing essentially horizontal beds out. So catastrophic failure. I don't know, maybe. I think there are signs that we could get maybe a little more failure than was initially reported on, just because, these fractures that we see up here, if that keeps pushing forward, again, this is, we discussed driving forces versus resisting forces. The driving force in this case is that down drop and bulldoze to the west, and the resisting forces are anything below each of the beds that are under here. But in this case, now we have openings, and pretty big ones, which will reduce the resisting forces of the beds. Remember, the beds that are getting pushed towards out the screen, basically towards you. But that brings, that certainly brings its the problems in itself, because there are so many. The fractures up here there are a lot, and we can see, as Cindy has reported about the rain, we can see gullies forming. I'll show you a better picture over here. Gullies forming here, gullies forming here. Again, undercutting the beds that are pushing towards us. Again, that reduces the resisting forces of anything coming out. But I think we got to temper, our expectations as far as catastrophic with that in mind. And there's great evidence here of the massive talus slopes that have formed in front of this, towards the bottom of the hill here. I mean, they are so thick that the access road for the irrigation pipe will probably never be cleared again. And that's sad, because if the weight of the talus, which probably will, break an already leaking irrigation pipe, that pipe will go out of service, and it will have to be reconstructed somewhere else. Nobody will go on here. They will probably find a spot towards the north to cut it and redirect it, and that seems quite possible. But I don't think that access road will ever be used again in this case. And there was, with the respect to the talus, there was a question regarding if the talus was buttressing the western face. Yes, indeed it is. In fact, in this case, it is helping, at least to this point. Anything below this line, where I'm kind of going across here, anything below this line, which I don't think anything down here is going to experience any kind of massive failure. But again, these cracks up here and the way this stuff is poking out, again, that's why it's coming off and you're getting little rock falls, because it's essentially flat. And as these beds get pushed towards us, it's just the exposed parts get whittled down ever so slightly. I mean, that's kind of where we're at with this thing, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view. That being said, the more undermining we get, the more fractures we get. And again, I point this one up here out because that is a continuation of that real minor shear fracture that we saw way in the beginning. Who would have thunk it? Pretty amazing. That little thing right there. That is just a continuation of that major fracture, or the dilation of movement to the west. Which is, I think, I implored on Cindy early on to concentrate on the west face for that reason. Again, this is moved to another picture here, but you can see, again, a few days ago, the bed's pushing out. Newly exposed rock, which seems pretty friable to me. That's why I'm a little concerned about what may happen next, but real friable stuff here. Because it's just, once it gets exposed, it just gets picked away quite easily. Again, what effect the recent rainfall would have had on this, it's going to have an effect. No question about it. The more rain, the more it will have an effect. Relative to, ooh, that was a good one. Yes, this is, again, this is a continuation of that fracture. Again, another exposed bed pushing out towards us. But all these transverse fractures, again, another bed pushing up, buckling in a sense from that western movement, from the down drop to the working face, which you see it back here, and the eastern scarp up here. Down drop of that, push towards the west, and these transverse fractures always give you normally, almost perpendicular to the movement. With any, do it with silly putty, do it with any kind of, backyard experiment. You push something down an inclined plane, you're going to get transverse fractures perpendicular to your movement, and we have a lot of them. But I find this, again, you can see it quite vividly here. Again, the resisting forces are reducing significantly. Whether this is a runoff, again, now this is a good example of the undermining, because now this bed or beds, maybe it's one or two, because this is now new, again, with the dealing with a landslide. Again, it's weight and the angle of inclination, and now we have a new angle of inclination, which is the western face, the angle of which is 30-40 degrees. That's pretty severe. When you keep undermining, now you've reduced the resisting forces on this side already, because you've undermined it here and here on both sides of this. This is cracking. You're reducing the resist. So a block of this size, breaking loose, again, using our old friend gravity, because we have no resisting forces in front of it. We're losing them on the side and this side, and the only thing that's resisting that is what's underneath of it and a little bit at the top. And I think that's kind of what we're going to experience here in the coming months. But these are pretty significant. If if there's any kind of failure within these horizontal beds, remember, whatever's going to have to happen is going to have to cut through that. It's not, these beds are not dipping towards, they're not dipping at the same angle as the western face. They're almost perpendicular to it, a little off perpendicular, but hence anything that juts out from that angle, which these have done, is going to start to fail. And at this point, it's gradual, as reported. That's what everybody assumed that would happen. And this is nothing, as it stands now, that hasn't already been reported or examined. And but I would be highly concerned with these fractures up here, because they are getting, they have not stopped in the entire year, and they keep growing. So yes, we may get block flip failures here. That's a lot of rock right there. A block failure in this general area. You have to assume with fractures this big that we're losing resisting forces all over. We can't even see the western, and that's a good point, the western failure surface, which we do not even see there anymore. We really can't define that. It is in there, right in here. So if that failure surface, that clay surface, the Sela clay bed, whatever it's called, whatever it's referred to, that was assumed to be the failure surface of this ridge towards the south, it could still operate towards the west. It's still there. I think that's what we have to keep in mind. It's always a compilation of everything that's going to happen, not a brand new day, so to speak. Always keep in mind what has been there, what has happened, but that slip plane, as you will, is still under there. Now, if the rock on the eastern side down drops some more and bulldozes this a little more, I don't know. It could be interesting. But as we've reported, and as has been reported, I can see where we will have some block failures here. Nothing. It's hard to say. It could be enough that could be held back by the containers down on the road, or it could be, it's once one block goes, something next to it can go again. Because we're now loading this face, because of the bulge and the western push of this rock to the west. We're loading on top of it, and we know we don't want to do that. Why? Because it added to the weight. Before this, we didn't have that much bedrock at this particular area. Now we've loaded it with more. It could be interesting. It is in some ways. It's unpredictable. It's hard to just sit here and be able to tell you exactly what's going to happen. I'm pretty amazed at where we're at now. But anyway, I think I just wanted to give more of a qualitative view on what was going on rather than get into a bunch of diagrams and whatnot. I think it's, another. But, yeah, the more these beds keep pushing out, the more they're going to overhang this area. And they whittle fast or they whittle slow. I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. And unfortunately, Cindy's going to have a lot of work in front of her, probably still. And I truly hope that she gets to see this through to the end, because she certainly deserves it. And she's spent enough time dealing with this, and I couldn't be prouder of her. But it's landslides are unpredictable, and this one is as complex as they come. No question about it, because it just to kind of enlighten people, it's usually, in my case certainly, when we go to a landslide, it's already happened. We never saw it. We never can't define the mechanism because there's a big pile of rock at the bottom of the hill, and it's we can take measurements, we can make general assumptions on things, but this one is unique in as much as it's kind of a landslide and suspended animation. I remember using that word with Cindy way back in the beginning, and it is neat to study because you get to see bit by bit, and in this case it is bit by bit, and we've I think come to realize over the year that whatever happens with this isn't going to be fast, and it's just kind of the way things are laid out and the way it is. But I would not rule out some block failures, and they could be massive. It really is somewhat conjecture on my part, but I just see these cracks have been, again, we got to compile everything together, and these cracks have been happening since the beginning, however small, meaning that stress, the shear stress in this case, has been operating for all that time, and there has to be an end game here, no question about it. But anywho, I think I've rambled on long enough, and I don't think I have. Yeah, I think we pretty much covered everything to just kind of bring it up to date. But I certainly hope you all hang with Cindy with this, and I'm really pleased to see all the good words for her, and the inspiration to keep going, because she's gonna need it. We love you, Cindy. You've enlightened me like you'll never know. But we'll keep an eye on it. you know, with this particular ridge, we've had movements that are significant, and then we have these times of cessation or relaxation that, you know, nothing happens. So we want to keep an eye on it, and this certainly might turn into just one big talus pile, or we may get some you know, transverse block failure in this case, transverse to the original landslide, transverse meaning to the west. So we'll see. I mean, we could be operating two landslides at once, but I mean, with that in mind, if there is major failure in this particular western face, that may be enough to take the weight off of the rest of the slide behind it. That might take a lot of weight off of it, and it really may calm the quarry part of it, the southern movement quarry part behind that towards the eastern scarp might relax it enough and take enough weight on it. It could take another 10 years before something happens. It's really tough to tell, but that's the best I can come up with. So that's it for now. Hopefully I won't be so much of a stranger, but thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.